Hi, I'm Faiza Sanjar, editor and director of JAMA Medical News.
And I'm Jennifer Bassi, senior staff writer for JAMA Medical News.
And today, Jen and I are going to be discussing highlights from news appearing in the October issues of JAMA. We're going to start off with two quick uptakes where we discuss recent events and findings in the world of medicine. First up is a potential biomarker-based screening tool for PTSD. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah. So there are currently no objective screening tests for PTSD or really any psychological conditions. And so the Army is working with NYU and Harvard and other researchers to come up with a biomarker-based screening test for PTSD. And so they've done that. And so what they found is that a mainly blood-based panel was 81% accurate for distinguishing veterans with and without PTSD.
Okay, and so this particular panel, now the screening tool, isn't necessarily meant to replace clinical diagnostic.
That's right. So it should be thought of as a screening tool versus a clinical diagnostic. So it's more like a mammogram or a PSA test for prostate cancer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So some of the biomarkers that are in the panel, it's a variety of things. So let's see. It includes epigenetic signals, metabolites, microRNAs, proteins, some routine lab markers. So that's insulin and mean platelet volume. And then heart rate was the only non-blood biomarker.
Okay, so a variety of different biomarkers. So, as with most studies, I'm sure this also comes with its caveats. Can you tell us a little bit about the limitations of this approach?
That's right. So the panel was developed and tested only in male veterans. And so to broaden it for clinical use, they would have to also test it in women, in current service members, active duty members, and civilians.
Okay. And if I recall, there were also some concerns that potentially the screening tool might actually be detecting depression rather than PTSD. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the tool was much more accurate among people who had both PTSD, clinician-diagnosed PTSD, and major depressive disorder. And so it's possible that it's picking up on that depression versus the PTSD. So they'll also need to test it in people who only have PTSD.
Okay, so stay tuned for future research on this. Okay, wonderful. So moving on to the next quick uptakes. In this particular quick uptakes, I actually cover a study that's looking at subconcussive football hits and the effects that might have on the brain. So, American football players, as we all know, sustain thousands of head hits every season of play. But not all of these head hits necessarily produce symptoms of concussion, like dizziness, blurred vision, and so on. So, these head hits are generally referred to as clinically silent or subconcussive. Now, generally speaking, we're always really focused on sort of the hard hits, the really evident hits that create clinical symptoms like concussion. But in this particular study that I discussed in this quick uptakes, which is based on a Sciences and Advances study, found that the subconcussive head hits were associated with the same type of brain damage as frank concussion. So briefly, the investigators at the University of Rochester Medical Center and Carnegie Mellon University and their colleagues used MRI to measure changes in midbrain white matter integrity in a cohort of 38 college football players over only a single season of play. The researchers focused particularly on the midbrain because it's been shown to be very biomechanically vulnerable to injury and also happens to be a common site of cellular pathology in concussion. So they also collected helmet-worn accelerometer data to track the location and number of head hits that the players sustained across the season, which unearthed some startling stats, actually. These football players sustained, in total, over 19,000 head hits. However, only 2 players had clinically defined concussion. And the MRI analysis revealed white matter midbrain integrity was reduced postseason compared to preseason, even among football players that had only subconcussive head hits. So the researchers then looked to see if the changes that they saw in midbrain white matter matched those seen among a cohort of NCAA athletes with clinically defined concussion. And as it turns out, they actually found the same telltale pattern or signature of midbrain white matter damage in both cohorts. So ultimately, the study suggested that this particular signature of white matter, midbrain white matter damage, could be used as a marker for subconcussive injuries resulting from football play. And ultimately, you know, it's not particularly practical to consider using MRI to screen for subconcussive or damage resulting from subconcussive injuries. So ultimately, the researchers mentioned that they actually want to be able to develop this research and this approach to use the helmet-worn accelerometer data and sort of the pattern and spatial pattern of head hits to identify players at high risk of injury, and that could potentially inform safe play and return to play decisions. So yeah, this was definitely something that was surprising to me because it sort of raised this question of, well, is there really any safe level of football play?
Right, and that's something that hits close to home to you because you're a mom and you have a little boy.
Yeah, exactly. And definitely, you know, people frequently will ask that question, you know, given everything now that we've been seeing in the literature, which is definitely starting to link, you know, these concussive and now subconcussive head hits with later brain trauma and even neurodegenerative processes like chronic traumatic encephalopathy. You know, these types of high-impact sports are definitely being scrutinized and put under the microscope and raising a lot of concerns. So for me personally, you know, I'd rather be safe than sorry and just not even encourage him to play any of these kinds of high-impact sports. But I mean, of course, there's a lot more research to be done in this area. So, all right. Well, now let's move on to your cardiovascular corner.
Okay, so I've rounded up some of the top headlines in cardiovascular health over the past few months. So I'll take you through some of them. So the first item I covered is about omega-3s and triglycerides. Mm-hmm. So this is a new scientific advisory that's come out from the American Heart Association that says that prescription omega-3 fatty acids at a dose of 4 grams per day is safe and effective for reducing high triglycerides in most people, not just people with very high triglycerides. And so this broadens the indication of omega-3s for reducing triglycerides.
Okay. And you had mentioned that the guidelines or the recommendations also suggest not using over-the-counter omega-3s. Is that right?
So the advisory committee recommends against using fish oil dietary supplements because they're not regulated by the FDA to the same degree that prescription agents are.
Okay, so this is very specific to just the prescription omega-3s.
Right. And so the advisory panel came to this conclusion by reviewing 17 clinical trials, including the recent Reduce It trial. And together, these studies suggested that prescription doses reduce triglycerides by 20 to 30%, regardless of whether or not people were on statins.
Okay, that's substantial.
Yep. Okay, so next we have a meta-analysis that was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association, and this is about stroke rehab. So most stroke patients, when they do rehab, the rehab is focused on functional improvements and less on aerobic capacity. And so what happens is that even after rehab is finished, a lot of people who have had strokes don't have a lot of endurance, and that affects their quality of life and risk factors for future cardiovascular events. And so this was a meta-analysis that looked at 19 studies, and these studies suggest that group-based aerobic programs can improve stroke patients' aerobic capacity. And this was regardless of how long ago people had their strokes.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And so the problem is that cardiac rehab isn't covered for stroke patients in terms of insurance. And so what the authors suggested is that patients can join community exercise programs or they can exercise on their own or with a trainer. And so the takeaway is that people who have had a stroke should be getting at least 30 minutes of aerobic exercise 2 to 3 times a week. And a cardiologist can provide advice on the appropriate intensities, and it can be just as simple as walking.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Okay, next, an observational study that was published in the European Heart Journal. So this is about when to discontinue statins in terms of elderly people who are taking them for primary prevention. Okay. So there's not a lot of guidance around when older people can or should stop statins for primary prevention. And so this was an observational study that looked at people who are around 75 years old at the time of the study who had no history of cardiovascular disease. So those who stopped statins had a 33% increased risk of being hospitalized for a cardiovascular event. So obviously this is an observational study, so it can't prove that stopping the statins caused the events. But there is an association that was found.
Okay, and the researchers, again, as always, suggest more work.
Right, so there actually is a larger randomized clinical trial that's going on in Australia that's specifically going to look at discontinuing statins for primary prevention in older people, but those results are not going to be available for a few years. Okay. So for now, this is one of the pieces of evidence that we have.
Okay, well, so stay tuned for results in the next few years.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. So to summarize then, we have omega-3s for hypertriglyceridemia, specifically prescription omega-3s. And next we have cardiac rehabilitation, improving stroke outcomes. And then finally, discontinuing statin use in those over age 75 may potentially be associated with greater risks. Particularly for those taking statins for primary prevention, correct?
Correct.
All right, so moving on. Next, I'm going to be discussing a JAMA infographic, which was developed in collaboration with the Kaiser Family Foundation. And this particular infographic focuses on the public's perspective on prescription drug costs, which is obviously a really hot topic now with the upcoming elections. This particular infographic is based on a Kaiser analysis of survey data. And they essentially found that over the last 20 years, drug spending has increased by 330% and has well outpaced the 208% increase in total health expenditures. So although most adults say that prescription drugs have made their lives better, they also say that the costs are unreasonable. And in fact, 3 in 10 report not taking medications as prescribed due to cost. And depending on insurance status, health status, income, the percentage of adults that say they have cut their pills, skipped doses, or substituted with some other over-the-counter drug varies, anywhere between 25% and all the way up to 51%. So the public sees pharmaceutical company profits as one of the top contributors to the high cost of prescription drugs. And lowering drug costs, not surprisingly, is one of the public's top health priorities for Congress. But interestingly, the public seems to support many actions that, regardless of their party affiliation. And about 90% of both Republicans and Democrats reported that they favor requiring drug companies to include list prices in ads. So clearly there's a lot of bipartisan support for certain strategies to mitigate lower drug costs.
Right. It was heartening to see that agreement across the aisle.
Yes, exactly. So this is one thing that certainly could benefit from a lot of bipartisan support and seems to cut across party lines and is a big concern for a lot of people. So
yeah, everybody wants more affordable drugs.
Absolutely. All right, so moving on. Next, I'm going to be covering some highlights and headlines from the Food and Drug Administration. So in the last several weeks, the FDA has approved an implantable neuromodulation device marketed as Barostim Neo for the improvement of symptoms in patients with heart failure who aren't candidates for cardiac resynchronization therapy. In addition, the FDA also approved the first treatment for interstitial lung disease associated with scleroderma, which is a very rare autoimmune disease that affects connective tissue. The drug Nintedanib, I think I got that right, was approved in 2014, first to treat a different interstitial lung disease. So this latest approval would actually expand this drug's indication. And finally, the first spinal tether device was approved to treat children and adolescents with idiopathic scoliosis, which is the most common form of scoliosis. Okay, so wrapping up news from the FDA, we'll move on to your biotech innovations column, where you cover the latest and greatest in biotech advances.
So unlike what you cover in the FDA column, the biotech advances that we talk about in the journal, in the news section of the journal, are not approved yet. This is all investigational stuff, usually pretty early in the process, phase 1, proof of concept.
So this is the future of medicine.
This is the future,
yes.
The cutting edge stuff.
All right.
So it's basically what we thought was cool this month and what we thought you guys would want to learn about. Okay, so the first item is about a new intubation guidance tool. And so this tool won a $20,000 award, and that it went to 5 biomedical engineering students from Columbia University in New York. Mm-hmm. So shout out to them and congratulations. Yes. This was their senior year capstone project. So it's called the InTouch Intubation Guidance System. So basically what it does is it helps insert the tube and the blade. And so it has LED lights that light up to help guide it in smoothly. Okay. And so. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, so then next is cuffless blood pressure monitoring. So what this is a smartphone-based tool that measures your blood pressure.
Oh, wow, more gadgets to do cool things, yes.
So basically it analyzes facial videos to determine blood pressure, and it does that by analyzing light modulations in the face, which relate to the pulsing arteries under the skin, which relates to blood pressure.
Interesting. And so the researchers here used machine learning essentially to train and test their software, correct?
Yes, and a lot of the items that we've been including in the biotech column lately do involve machine learning. We could pretty much just exclusively cover machine learning if we wanted to,
yes,
but
that is
we
true.
try to mix it up.
Oh, right.
But there's so much research going on in that realm.
Yes.
So this smartphone-based measuring tool was highly accurate. It was around 95% accuracy compared to standard continuous blood pressure monitoring.
Oh, wow.
So, but there are some caveats. So the researchers need to test it in people who actually have high blood pressure. So in this study, it was trained and tested in people who were normotensive. And they also need to develop it and test it with people who are of more diverse races and skin tones.
Oh yeah, related to that, interesting sidebar. I attended a conference where one of the speakers mentioned that the first line of sensor soap dispensers actually didn't end up working for people of darker skin tones, and so I'm assuming that a similar problem, is the same issue,
potential
here.
issue,
exactly. So have to make sure that you go back and test in a wide variety of populations.
Yeah. Okay, finally, we have a new method rather than a gadget. So this is the use of laser-excited gold nanoshells to destroy prostate tumors. Oh. And so these nanoshells preferentially accumulate in the tumor, so it's a highly targeted approach. And so this is a very early proof of concept study. I think there were 16 people in the study, so a lot of further research is needed, but it's a promising approach.
Oh, wonderful. All right. Okay, next we're going to discuss 2 features. The first written by our Associate Managing Editor, Becky Volker. And her story discusses how best to guide conversations revolving around ending cancer screening in older adults. So several guidelines use a life expectancy of less than 10 years as a rule of thumb to stop annual cancer screenings. But for many physicians, this is a very uncomfortable topic to broach, and it's not entirely clear how best to wade into this delicate subject of life expectancy with healthy older adults. So to get at this issue, Becky reports on a recent study that surveyed both physician and patient perspectives on how best to discuss life expectancy in clinical decision-making to stop cancer screening. And not surprisingly, older patients reported not really liking discussing life expectancy. I mean, nobody likes to be told, hey, we're stopping your cancer screening because you only have 10 years left to live. However, when ending cancer screening conversations were framed more in terms of age, health, and functional abilities, all of which are actually inputs used to calculate life expectancy, patients were far more receptive to having this conversation. And importantly, physicians don't have to worry about disappointing their patients by suggesting that it's time to stop screening, because most of the surveyed patients said they wouldn't think badly of their physician for making such a suggestion, which I thought was very promising. And one of the sort of consensus decisions that came out of the reports, that both physicians and patients agreed that after thoroughly discussing the risks and benefits of stopping screening, that the ultimate decision would be in the hands of the patient.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was interesting about this story was the idea that there's all this awareness now around screening, cancer screenings, and we need to sort of do the same thing, raise awareness around the idea that these cancer screenings don't need to go on forever.
Yes, that's very true. Ultimately, there's such a push, and there's so much, messaging around get your colonoscopy or get your this screening, that screening, mammograms every year annually, that I think people get really used to that routine and don't realize that, yes, it doesn't have to go on forever.
Yeah.
All right, so our next story is a feature written by Rita Rubin, one of our senior staff writers, which discusses recent efforts to ease contraceptive access. Now, perhaps surprising to many, and it was surprising to me at least, the rate of unintended pregnancies in the US is hovering at 45%. And inconsistent or lack of contraceptive use is one of the main drivers of unintended pregnancies. So one of the biggest obstacles in obtaining contraceptives is the need for a clinic office visit and a prescription. So in her story, Rita covers 3 main strategies that are being investigated to address these barriers and ease contraceptive access, potentially helping to reduce unintended pregnancies. So these include pharmacist prescribing, making oral contraceptives available over the counter, and web-based contraceptive prescribing. Just recently, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists expanded its over-the-counter birth control recommendation to include other forms of contraception beyond the birth control pill. So not surprisingly, each of these approaches have their benefits and drawbacks, and research is ongoing to support effectiveness and safety of each of these strategies. However, some experts have warned that these approaches may replace an access barrier with a cost barrier due to insurance coverage issues. However, there has been recent legislation put forward to require insurers to cover over-the-counter oral contraceptives, at least, should they become available.
Right, so there's a potential unintended consequence if birth control goes over the counter, which is that right now the Affordable Care Act requires insurers to cover prescription birth control.
Exactly.
It does not require insurers to cover over-the-counter birth control.
Exactly.
So they'll be swapping the barrier of access for the barrier of cost.
Exactly. So that is definitely an issue that will need to be addressed, potentially through legislation, although, many have said that relying on legislation, which can be piecemeal and differ from state to state, might not really be the most effective or efficient approach, but at least it's one quiver in the bow, as it were. So
yeah, it was nice to see this sort of suite of options that are being pursued to improve contraceptive access that Rita covered in her story.
Yes, so the future is looking bright. So that concludes our summary of highlights and medical news. Thanks for joining us. You can read all of the stories that we've discussed online at jamanetwork.com. And you can also find a lot of other news content, including Health Agency's update, clinical trials update, the JAMA forum, and other interesting topics that we cover, other features as well. So please go online to read all of that, and also visit the JAMA Medical News podcast to hear an audio recording of this discussion. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you next month.